Yeah.
Yeah, most of our students.
And a lot of them are coming from they have back-to-back seminars.
Hello, everyone. We're glad that you could join us. What an excellent crowd willing to be indoors on this beautiful, beautiful spring day here in Chapel Hill. I'm so glad that you're interested in joining us today for this talk from Melanie Feinberg, a proud affiliate here at CTAP and an associate professor in the School of Education and Library Science. Anyway, I'm Kate Peters. I'm CTAP's executive director. CTAP is dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, media, and other forms of digital information. In that context, design, use, and govern them. We're especially interested in studying people, platforms, and power. This research takes a holistic approach to studying technology that's focused on how social inequality and power structures shape the use, deployment, and impact of technology. Committed to equality and justice in our scholarship, teaching, and dissemination of research. In that spirit, I'd like for us all to take a moment today to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology systems and society. Our center occupies the ancestral land of many native species, not limited to the Shipori, the Tuscarora, and Lumpkin, and remains home today to the Occaneechi band of the nation. The university was funded in its early years through the sale of lands home to the Cherokee and Chickasaw Nation. I invite you to join us in acknowledging our shared responsibility to pursue reconciliation and justice work that we do here. Today, I'm really honored to introduce Melanie Feinberg. She's an associate professor in the UNC School of Information and Library Science, a classificationist whose research combines design and humanities. Her work focuses on learning how to read and write databases to complement our engineering and mining work. In her professional career before returning to academia, she was a content strategist and editor. She's an Apple. She is one of CTAC's most active affiliates. She's been generous with her time and her insights. She's provided excellent feedback and mentorship to many of our students and others engaged. Deeply grateful for all of her work, and we're lucky to get to present her today and to offer her this forum and a chance for all of you to hear and learn from her as well. So, Dr. Feinberg, please. Please. As we go thank everyone for coming, and also to thank Pat for inviting me, and especially Katie for organizing everything, and also Juliana for serving as my I'll say this right up front. I'm more comfortable with writing than talking. It's been a long time. So in that sense, wait, it did. Like which one? Here's the flavor might not be working. Let me get you the keyboard. I apologize. We have this symposium tomorrow at SILS all day, and our students are doing panels, and they've all been asking me, like, will the setup in our rooms be the same as in our classroom, so that like we'll know that it's work and we can plug in our stuff and excellent vamping. The arrowkey should work for you now. Excellent. All right. So, in the spirit of adventure, my plan for this talk is not to provide a direct synopsis of the book, but instead to illustrate some of the book's and goals by taking a little walk through my current headspace
sharing some observations and anecdotes that I've been thinking about recently. And so both to surface some of the ideas that arise in the book, but also to mirror some of the process that I've underwent while writing it. But where the book reflects many iterations of revising and polishing, this talk will be a lot messier, dirtier, a lot more unruly, like the data that I'm describing. But I'll begin by just taking a moment to introduce myself, my area of expertise. So I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a journalist, I'm not an education studies person, I'm not a legal scholar, nor am I a policy. I align with CTAP through information scientist. And as Katie alluded to, I'm a particularly old-fashioned and gnarly kind of information scientist. I'm a classificationist. And that means I study the selection, description, and arrangement of stuff. Collection of stuff. So the term collection often brings to mind physical things like collections of stamps or paperweight. And some collections do bring together physical things. The traditions of information science emerge from an interest in physical things like books. The collections also bring together digital things. The World Wide Web is a collection of documents encoded in HTML. YouTube is a collection of time-based visual media. And sometimes the things that are being collected are data in physical or digital form. A library is a collection of books, and a library catalog is a collection of data about books. A library catalog is a data set. In primary school, when I first started, right, catalog of book data was instantiated on paper cards, special card. Today, the catalog of book data is digital, but the card catalog, the online catalog are both data sets. So another way to describe myself as a scholar then is this. I study the design and implementation of data sets. That link between classification and data is actually vital. It's my expertise as a classificationist that informs my distinction as a scholar of data. The conceptual foundation of my scholarship is that there is a fundamental similarity between collection physical things, collection digital things, and collections of data about them. It enables me to understand data in the same way that I understand things like cheese in the soup, selection, description, and arrangement. This is key to my conception for the book, that I can relate everyday anecdotes about common things in the world and explain how those everyday phenomena work in the same way that ineffable and arcane substance is data. Like, for instance, so you know how in a lot of supermarkets there's the normal cheese that's often in the dairy case by the butter and eggs that looks like this. And then there's the fancy. So they can be a completely different location in the store, maybe by the deli or the olive bar, if there is one. The fancy cheese often has a very complicated arrangement, one that hints at a diverse array of complex characteristics being applied. For instance, the fancy cheese might be arranged by characteristics like country or in the region of its origin, circumstances of the aging process, the animal that the milk comes from, specifics about the bacteria or mold, culture the cheese. Indeed, the fancy cheese is suffused with very specialized technical data, even down to the names of varieties, which often reference extensive cultural traditions, manufacturing distinction. Meanwhile, The normal cheese is primarily distinguished by its form or shape. Ox. Trick. The implication of this, the thing to take away, is that from a data perspective, the fancy cheese and the normal cheese are two different things, two different entities. And that to me is a very important aspect of data that tends to get lost in the mix. Data is a description of something. It's always about something, but at the same time, this thingness is not inherent. Thingness is more of a perspective, essence. Thingness is a decision. It's a decision whether or not any particular substance, fancy cheese or normal cheese, or maybe even cheese. These decisions form the basis of any data set. They shape what we think we know about the world and how we can interact with things we know about it. For a fancy cheese, where it comes from matters, but not its shape or form. For a normal cheese, shape prevails. So what are we describing? What is this data about? What is it generally? These are important foundational questions when it comes to understanding data. And because thingness, mutable and debatable, contestable, and invariably depends on some human perspective, all data has an unruly aspect, which is not necessarily a problem. It's just reality. The reality of what data is as a human artifact. But understanding different ways in which that unruliness can manifest is pretty important, I think, especially if we want to be responsible and accountable creators and processors and users of data. One of the pervasive themes of the book involves exploring that human character of data and the uncertainties that accompany. So I'm going to riff on that theme for a bit, and I'll start by considering a series of images that I would say seem pretty straightforward in terms of what they represent. So here's the first one. If I were to ask what is depicted in the image, and this one's also a dog. 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 Dogs. Dog. They're all dogs. Or maybe none of them are dogs. I have two images. The first two are dingoes. Third is a coyote, and the last is a wolf. At the same time, as images, all of them seem pretty dog-like. If I needed an image of a dog for something, I wouldn't reject any of them. So I was thinking about this recently because I was reviewing an article in the journal. And the article was about creating training data for machine learning. Specifically, it was about describing images with labels to represent the content of those images. A fundamental premise of the manuscript was that labeling cats, dogs, or horses is easy, but labeling human gender is hard. So given what I've said about my emphasis on uncertainty and ambiguity of data in the book, you can imagine that I seized on this premise right away. Labeling cats, dogs, and horses must be. We have three labels: cat, dog, horse, and we have what seem like distinct images that match our perception. But of course, once we put dogs next to dingoes, coyotes, and wolves, the plot thickens. The manuscript that I was reviewing was using cats and dogs as an example of how in it many of the concepts that we employ to make sense of the world around us are relative. And people generally agree on how to associate those concepts with actual things in the world. As another example of this relative stability, the manuscript offered a different kind of data, human age. According to the manuscript, humans generally know that if asked to provide our age, the answer should be given in years, corresponding to the amount of time the Earth takes to travel around the sun. Reasonable on its face. Well, that example also undercuts the contention of relative conceptual stability that the paper was trying to make. Of course, humanity has had and still has many calendaring systems along with different ways of determining human ages. So the Islamic calendar, for instance, is lunar and not solar. But Islamic months travel around the Gregorian calendar. Age, therefore, is different than the reckoning of the Islamic calendar. In the Gregorian calendar, I'm 52. In the Islamic calendar, I'm 50. Likewise, there are also different ways of counting years, even for calendars. So Korea, for instance, is a calendar. However, traditional Korean reckoning of human age is different. The traditional way of expressing human age in Korea is that a newborn baby is age 1, and everyone in the country adds another year to their age on New Year's Day. So I'm also 54 in Korea and not 52. Human age, just like cats and dogs, has an unruly aspect if we look for it. There are always possibilities for data to be uncertain or ambiguous. So at first, this cats and dogs thing seems simple to me. It was just a case of underestimating the way that there are always these contested cases where some people might make distinctions between dogs and dingoes, either generally or in certain situations, and other people might say that they're essentially the same, at least for certain purposes. In the book, I have a whole chapter on this phenomenon, a chapter called Functional Equivalence, where I ponder whether two things are effectively the same or not. And I use examples like different editions of Hamlet. So this is a problem that has bedeviled information science for decades, if not centuries. Or everyday world, American Coke and Mexican Coke. Or a particular favorite, Girl Scout Thin Mint. So if you weren't aware, there are two bakeries that produce Girl Scout, ABC, Little Brownie. And the cookies between the two bakeries differ, sometimes very slightly and sometimes unlocked. Some of the cookies have the same names across both bakeries, but some of the cookies have different names. For instance, Little Brownie produces Moas, ABC is Caramel Delights. The Moas and Caramel Delights taste pretty similar, but the names are different. Thin Mints have the same name across bakeries and share many manufacturing details, but there are also differences between them. The ABC cookies have a little bit more sugar, a little less fiber. The ABC cookies are also made in a facility that processes milk, peanuts, and coconut, where the Little Brownie cookies are made in a facility that processes peanuts, milk, eggs. Some people notice the thicker chocolate coating on the Little Brownie cookies, the more pronounced holes on the ABC. Connoisseurs believe the ABC cookies taste more strongly. Are the ABC Thin Mints and the Little Brownie Thin Mints the same cookie? Are they functionally equivalent? Maybe. It depends on how much of a Girl Scout cookie connoisseur you are. So we're all very familiar with these kinds of examples because we encounter them all the time. So here's another fun one that occurred in my life recently. So we started watching the Netflix series Beef in our house. Okay, don't tell me what happens because we've only watched 2 episodes. But in the second episode, there's an exhibition at an art gallery. It's an exhibition of chairs. Except they're not chairs, they're art. People are repeatedly told not to sit on the art. Because we don't sit on art, even if it seems like a chair. So in the show, this was all supposed to be funny and satiric about the art world. It was. But then, a few days after we saw that episode, the New York Times reviewed an exhibition at a new Brooklyn gallery that included various chair-like objects, some of which are art and not to sit on, and some of which are chairs and fine to sit on. I'm not making this up. Part of the point of both the exhibition and the gallery itself is to demonstrate how arbitrary and fluid it is to say that something is art and something is design, which is true, of course. But the gallery owners quoted in the Times article invoked a market aspect that I find very telling. Traditional art galleries, they complain, don't like to show design objects because that compromises their fine art credibility. There is not just cachet, but also a market value differently associated with art as opposed to functional pieces, which again speaks to the potential incommensurability of the data aspect. So if you buy one of the arty looking chairs, say the one carved out of solid bluestone, and then put it on a pedestal and don't sit on it, does its value change, either higher or lower, as it transitions from chair to art? A thing that has one value as an art object perhaps has a different value if it's a chair. Data about the exact same thing that's collected under different contexts can't necessarily aggregate it. So as one more example of this, again, ripped from this week's headline, German artist and photographer Boris Eldison recently won the open category of the 2022 Sony Film Photography. But his submission had actually been generated by an AI. Eldison had submitted the image just to see what would happen. And then he refused to accept the award because, as he told the BBC, they're different entities. AI is not photography. Nevertheless, I heard Eldison's interview on the BBC, and he does think that his winning image is art. It's just not photographic art. He calls it promptographic art because it was created via a text description rather than created camera. Eldison was pretty firm that his decades of experience as an artist and photographer were what enabled him to craft text description to produce the winning image. That's why he called the image art, albeit a different kind of art. I also looked at some of Eldison's actual photographic images, and they're stylistically and compositionally quite similar to his promptographic image. Just by looking at them superficially, it's not hard to see them as artistic works by the same creator. Of course, these works are different in their technique and materials, and that's why Eldison claims they're different entities. But Eldison's perspective as an artist himself is perhaps also different from that of a layperson merely considering two similar looking images. His images are perhaps also distinguished by their value, but the difference in value remains unsettled for promptographic. In any case, as I said, there are manifold examples that illustrate these kinds of issues where data is uncertain because sameness is uncertain, or where data about what appears to be the same thing might actually be about different things. And so aggregating that data might cause a problem. But there's actually maybe even a more subtle kind of unruliness to cats and dogs. A potential slippage between things as they exist in the world and representation. Because the real situation posed by the manuscript that I was reading wasn't identifying phenomena as they exist in the world, but labeling images to describe their content. Dogs and wolves or foxes might be different biological species and organisms in their world. But when it comes to a figure in an image, what does a label really mean? The underlying question being, when we're labeling an image, what kind of statement are we making? Are we saying something about the image or about the thing represented in the image? So the problem case from the manuscript that I was reviewing involved labeling gender. And that case brings this issue to the fore. If gender is a matter of personal identity, then it's not something that can be described as a property of images or visual perception at all. It's how a person understands themselves, and the relationship to what that person looks like is tangential. So as another kind of identity example, I'm an introverted, part of how I understand myself, part of my internal subconscious. You could label a picture of me as either introverted or extroverted, and that might provide data about how you understand the image. However, that label wouldn't have anything to do with my actual feeling as a person. It would just be someone's way of describing something about an image that happened to include me in it. I talk about this kind of idea in my book in relation to the implementation of data and how different ways of assigning data values can affect what the data means or says. Paying attention to data implementation, another continuing theme of the book. I talk about this a lot in the final chapter, which focuses on the idea of locality in terms of a data creator's position relative to the thing being described. As such, social and cultural assumptions confuse what may seem very technical matters. In that chapter, I use race as a significant example of locality, specifically how race is implemented as data and how that varies according to social, historical, and cultural context. So a lot of the stories that I tell in the book involve teaching, as does one of the stories in that chapter about a classroom exercise that I do, that I may also have done this semester, where I have students contemplate different data values for race and ethnicity that are available to select from in different online data. As part of this conversation, I asked students to envision other ways of collecting race and ethnicity data, so that instead of you, the person creating your profile, selecting a value from a controlled vocabulary to describe your race or ethnicity, perhaps people that you dated select a value describes their perception of your race or ethnicity. Or perhaps there's a panel of independent assessors that makes this determination. The same potential data values are used, those don't change. But instead of describing yourself, other people are describing you based on their interactions with the person or with the image associated with their profile. So just like your reaction, these possibilities quick students out, which is exactly the reaction I hope for, because it really brings home how just changing the way that data values are assigned can totally change what the data represents. If I describe myself as white, that's like me describing myself as an introvert. It's a statement about my identity. If someone describes an image of me as white, that's a visual perception of my physical characteristics. It doesn't describe my identity in terms of how I perceive myself. Of course, in different places and times, race has been assigned to individuals in many different ways, using different implementation mechanisms and types of evidence. It wasn't that long ago that census takers in the United States, for instance, assigned race data to residents. That kind of data implementation used to be normal, that kind of data. Now maybe it doesn't. What this example demonstrates is that what you can say about something in the world based on what you perceive from an image of that thing may be both uncertain and unsettled. Okay, so now comes the part of the talk in which I take a scenic detour through the history of information. In information science, an image is just one kind of document. A document being anything that conveys information or can be as evidence. So the question, when we're labeling an image, what kind of statement are we making, has a more general form that we can express like this. When we're describing a document, what kind of statement are we making? This question was stated by my forebear classificationist in the 19th century, who asked questions like, when we're developing systems to describe and relate documents, are we representing the universe of knowledge about the world? Or are we representing the bibliographic universe? For some of these classificationists, describing the contents of books was or should be the same process as describing knowledge about the world. But for other classificationists, describing the contents of books was not the same as describing phenomena in the world, because what people write about is not the same as what exists, and the kinds of data that are important to describe the aboutness of books aren't the same kinds of data that might be about other things in the world. So in 1911, the librarian E. Wyndham presented this debate this way. Philosophical classification aims at teaching the essential relations between classes of things, while book classification is having the books most used together in the classes. The functions of the two orders, therefore, are essentially distinct. And this being so, there will be a strong prima facie case for believing that the orders of the two systems will also be divergent. For Home, the basis for creating a bibliographic classification properly lies in what people write about, in his terms, literary print, and not in what exists in the world of part of science. As Home observes, no monograph, for instance, has yet been published on the chemistry of iron or of gold, making this an argument for not making the periodic table of the elements foundation of a classification scheme for books about inorganic chemistry, even as the periodic table of the elements might be the foundation of chemical knowledge. This same question was revisited in a slightly different way by the British Classification Research Group, or CRG, in the 1970s. The CRG was at the cutting edge of what we might today call data or ontology development, which they call the development of indexing. For the CRG, there was likewise a clear distinction to be made when discussing data about phenomena and data about documents. One of the CRG members, Derek Austin, called this the Chinese plate syndrome, based on the observation of another CRG member, Robert Fairthorne, that there is a difference between classifying art objects and classifying books about art. Of course, books might include or imply statements about phenomena in the world. However, statements that we make about books and their content are not directly statements about the world. A statement that you make about an image that depicts me is not the same as the statement I make to describe my own identity. A statement that you might make about a chemistry book is not the same as a statement about chemical knowledge. Both kinds of statements can be valid, but their uses are different, and it might not be appropriate to combine, aggregate, like them. There were others who thought differently from Home and the CRG, who believed that there was a way to align bibliographic data to scientific consensus, degrees of knowledge, rather than the pragmatics of information retrieval. The 19th and early 20th century Belgian classificationist Paul Olay was especially obsessive in this respect. Olay proposed getting rid of documents altogether and instead extracting the facts out of documents, organizing those extracted facts with a supercharged classification scheme, and then using a system of standardized paper sizes, special cabinets to create what was essentially a proto-knowledge base. In the 1990s, Olé was positioned as a precursor to hypertext and the World Wide Web. But Olé's vision aligns more with what Tim Berners-Lee originally called the semantic web, which has also been called the web of data or linked data, and which is now associated with the term knowledge. So my detour into the history of classification theory demonstrates another theme or goal of the book to connect current matters of concern to conversation concepts. The work of Home and the CRG was on my mind recently as I contemplated a new article by Andrew Iliadis and colleagues about schema.org, a decade-old project started by Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Yandex. Schema.org is a vocabulary to mark up web pages with structured data. So I'll try to explain what that means for people who are unfamiliar. So first, let's think about a normal web page. The basic markup for web pages, HTML, is essentially a set of formatting. HTML provides a way to format text, make it easier for people. The content on basic web pages is just unstructured text, which is not easy for computers to process. Schema.org is implemented as a markup language like HTML. However, schema.org doesn't encode formatting instructions for web page content. Schema.org encodes structural information about web page. So if you have a web page of a banana bread recipe, you can use schema.org markup to declare that your page is of type recipe. The recipe type defined by schema.org has an array of properties that you can use to identify components of the recipe, such as ingredients and cooking time. Moreover, the types that schema.org defines have a hierarchical structure. A recipe, for instance, is a kind of how-to. Because a recipe is a kind of how-to, properties associated with other how-tos also apply to recipes. So because how-to have steps, recipes also. Similarly, a how-to is a type of creative work. So because creative works have names, authors, names or titles, recipes also. So this is schema.org markup for the banana bread recipe problem. So this says that the page is of type recipe, its name, author, time, preparation time, ingredient steps, and so on are indicated in this schema.org problem. Because this data is consistently structured, search engines can use it to do things like this, to identify web pages that are recipes and present a special view of recipe-related data with important bits. Another application of schema.org that some of you might be familiar with, schema.org includes claim review type that fact checkers can use to identify pages with claims made in other documents. Google provides a search utility that uses this claim review schema.org markup to retrieve fact checks associated with the claim. This all gets even more complicated because you can use the same schema.org markup to refer to a web page, parts of a web page, or to the content of a web page, what the web page is about. And especially in cases where we have layers of documents referring both to other documents and to things in the world, as with the example of claim reviews, it can get challenging for me at least to tangle when schema.org markup is making a statement about a document or a statement about something else. So here is an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. This slide shows a web page of an article from USA Today that is performing a fact check of an online rumor. In this case, a rumor that Amtrak is 1 year passes, 48. The slide also shows some of the schema.org markup for the story. Schema.org includes properties to identify both the claim being reviewed and the source or item where the claim has been made. So in this markup, source is clearly identified. It's a Facebook post, and we can even use that URL there to find the post in question. So in this case, the claim is clearly associated with the source document in which it appears. But a claim review can also omit the item reviewed and therefore be a statement directly about the world rather than a statement about a document. In this example, there is no associated item review. This web page is asserting that most offers of extended auto warranties are scams, but it's not checking the source. Here, the schema.org claim review markup is making a contention about a class of things that exist in the world. Robocalls offering car warranties, without reference to a particular document in which such a claim is either made or refuted. So, really that much of a difference between saying that robocalls offering car warranties are generally scams and evaluating a particular document in which one such offer appears. I don't know, it kind of makes me uncomfortable. An assertion that a document's claims aren't supported has a different scope than an assertion that a claim generally isn't. And with schema.org statements, it's unclear, especially what they might eventually be. All just very slippery, which is the point. The scope of schema.org is ontological. What is being modeled by schema.org? That's a big question, maybe something for me to ponder during my summer vacation. But I do know that the same kinds of uncertainty bound up in that question are also bound up in more familiar everyday questions that we all have a better grasp of. Is all data about thin mints about the same thin mint? When is a chair a sculpture? What can an image say about my race? And that's the last goal of the book that I wanted to highlight. I wanted it to be fun and accessible for everyone, but especially for students. Because I know that detour through the history of classification theory is a little tough to get to. And that process turned out to be a large part of the journey of the book. One thing that I've learned over the years is that translating technical jargon into everyday language isn't just a matter of changing expression. For me, at least, it's a generative act that often forces me to totally reevaluate stuff that I thought I knew, sometimes for the third or fourth or maybe the 50th or 80th time. It's a messy process, full of dead ends and pretty darn unruly. A lot like what I've shared. Okay. So that's it for my remarks, and I look forward to the questions.
We structured this event to be an in conversation with, and we'll kick off some of the conversation portion. I'd like to also introduce now Juliana Serkin, who is a student in information science, computer science, and law here at UNC. And who's along with some of our other CTABers been reading through this book and enjoying it. I'll pull up a couple of shares here, and we'll kick off with a few questions directly, and then we'll also be opening it up to the audience. I'm going to stay over here. Oh, okay. All right. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. Yes. Okay.
Hi everyone. Thank you for Katie, your introduction. I'm Julian. Lovely to be here with you all. So my first question, I loved your book, by the way. It reminded me about if Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about information science. That was what I was thinking. So my first question was about your epigram, the quote that you chose for the beginning, and just to share with everyone, this is what it is. I see a preoccupation with the deep structure, the underlying structure, with the gesso underpainting that is red earth, black earth. So I wanted to ask you, what does this quote, or what can we take from this quote that will inform us about your experience writing this book, as well as your overall creative philosophy?
I had a hint of some of these questions in advance, and like over lunch, I wrote on these notes, and there were way too many things that I could say about that question, and so many of these questions. The structure part, structure is my preoccupation. And for me, structure is relationships, and partly it's identifying the relationships that choose to reverse. So that's one of the things in that quote. The other aspect of that is that's a quote from Gloria Ancelotta's Borderlands blog. And I talk about this in the introduction to the book a little bit, but that quote and trying to integrate the ideas from that book into my work as an information scientist, has been very much tied up in the process of writing the book, and also I hope what came out of that. And that's been a really long, not just the process of writing the book, but as I mentioned in the introduction, my first semester as a faculty member at the University of Texas, I had a master's student who kind of studied with me, and Kristen Hogan. And Kristen was a little bit of an unusual master's student, although in high schools we sometimes have doctoral students who also have PhDs. And Kristen had a PhD in English literature and had been a professor of queer studies at Tulane. Yeah. And she was very confounded by the literature of information science, not just in but how it's said. and Alcima's work was very important for Kristen, and we had conversations. I wonder what is consciousness is like how and then I love they go together, and so that how those things might go together, but also the way in which Angoldua makes the substance of the writing part of the content, like that. So all of those things go into that. Talk for hours and hours.
Well, I was curious. I've never heard of Dr. Ancelotti's work before, and so when I saw the quote, I was like, what is this? I hadn't recognized it from a book I read before on information science. And so I looked it up, and when I read the description, it does relate. It talks about the ambiguities of race, gender in the Chicana experience, and I completely understood what you meant by that, but I wanted to address it for everyone. That was my first question. Katie, do you want to go with the second?
Sure, I'll build from that.
Okay.
I'll come over for a second. On that same race and gender piece, you noted in the talk that the census question on race has changed in how it's collected from being evaluated by the census taker and answered by a recipient. One of the other ways it's actively in the process of changing is that there's an open comment period about restructuring question right now.
Yes.
PTAP has actually gotten lightly consulted by the civil rights community on this. There's a debate around how to restructure it. It is currently two questions. Those of you who filled out a census or a government form recently might know. One asks about racial or ethnic identity, and the other asks about Hispanic background or heritage. And those are distinct questions. There's been a groundswell movement to structure them into a single question, so that Hispanic or Latino origin is treated alongside racial categories like white, black. And that's actually not a monolithic proposal either, but it feels that one of the ways that those of us being measured and increasingly measured in the system to try to influence being measured by. We brought up gender. I also really love there's a Twitter account called Rate My Gender Question, run by a legal scholar named Kendra Albert. Features of gender questions that you as an individual are asked to answer online, and they'll tell you how effectively they capture the nuances of gender, at least in the perspective of a scholar. From all this work, do you have advice or how does understanding this history better empower these communities who are trying to control it, how we're measured and
Such a big question. You know, one of the things that I would say is that the boring details matter. And it's also like a struggle that I feel like I enact every day. The details are like information times. The way it's written, especially, is boring, and part of it is like these technical details, right? And it's not the way that most people want to be like engaging, especially like big issues, right? Like on a very detailed level. On the other hand, like those details can really matter. So, you know, like, and I looked at that Twitter account over lunch, and it's great. And part of why it's great is because it does pick apart like little things, right? And one of the challenges in intersection between the way that we think about concepts, like in the everyday world, and the way that concepts get translated as data, is that like, so for in the best practice data, every property should represent like a single concept, right? Because when you have a complex idea, then there are too many different ways that intersect that it can be described, right? And this is part of the difficulty with the rate. There's too much going on. But then it's like, well, how do we decompose that? And that's where like we don't have a good group. And so like that's going, and with gender too, right? Like that's part of how like that's going to be a problem. But even just recognizing, right? Like all of, and the worst one, which is a way to maybe have this kind of thinking about things a little less fraught, is genre. So genre is something that everyone thinks like, oh, I sort of get that, like I get what genre means, any like, but genre is really complicated as to implement as data because it involves so many different kinds of concepts coming together. Like if we think about what is comedy, well, something that makes you laugh. What is romance? It's a kind of plot, right? Like where things were together. What is drama? It's like a characteristic of, I wouldn't say not making you laugh, but like how plot comes together. So it's like all of these different kinds of concepts, but if we were to break them out separately, it would seem wrong. That's not how we think. That's one of the difficulties too with things like race. If we were to break them apart, then, and that's part of the thing that people are trying to remedy with the census, is things that were broken apart to oh, that's not the way we think about this. We want to put them together. Then when we put them together, what does that actually mean? I guess that's the other aspect. It's like, it's all going to, which in some ways freeing. Like, it's freeing to know that all of it is kind of terrible. The challenge with something like census. So one of the things that I really liked about that gender rating thing was that the person who did it was really, what is the lot? What is the school? Like, that was something that they wanted to specify when that question was asked, like, what is this for? Which is another way of saying, like, what is the scope, right? Like, what is the scope under which we are understanding the context? And I feel like that's really important because not just in terms of disclosure and how, but like the way that we might understand what that data is different. So being able to say in advance what is different something like seems really important. But for the census, like that didn't play. Like that's also something to think about as being and affording the data being able to do it. And all of these things. Not necessarily. And of course it's going to be that.
This kind of tees up my next question. Just the idea that no matter what we do is going to end up terrible. So in the chapter on equivalence, you actually kind of say this in a very poetic way. I read it and I was like, oh, this is the nugget. Okay, this is the quote. The inevitability of imperfection need not be a deterrent to action. I wrote, ooh, that applies to me. So I think like we can all get bogged down these days trying to organize the perfect paper or the perfect event, organize the perfect class, things like that. But on a larger scale, what do you think is a field of study in information science or otherwise, where the inevitability of imperfection has made this field static when it really needs action?
Yeah. You know, another thing that I emphasize at different points in the book is, in addition to acknowledging that imperfection is acknowledging that it's a process, right? That data is a process, and you know, like there's so many ways in which like this census stuff should have been changed, like 4 censuses ago, right? But it's like it's hard, the inertia to get over this is hard. Because putting together all of this infrastructure is a big project. We also tend to have this idea that like there is this section possibly reach. But if we give that up, it's like it's always going to be imperfect. Then we can embrace the process. Like this is something that's always going to be continually changing. And that's also okay.
I continue? Okay. So this question is a bit of a doozy, and it relates to whoever has taken INLS 523. It kind of involves the one-to-one cardinality principle. So you talk about this principle also on the chapter on equivalence, and you use this example of the Palmyra ruins shortly after the ISIS attack to kind of show that, you know, the data between this image and data values that were associated with it structurally were organized using the one-to-one cardinality principle, but actually the data related to the image in so many different ways, and the image conveys so many different types of information. And you express the view that's in that generally it's not necessary to actually enforce the one-to-one principle without these types of minor violations, because it introduces a level of complexity that's not generally noticed. But my question to you is, do you think that these cultural heritage institutions that deal with issues that involve so many different social and geopolitical perspectives have a responsibility to actually enforce these structural principles more thoroughly? And even on the flip side, do they have a responsibility to recognize the more nuanced relationships?
That's funny because in my classes yesterday, data in Europeana and the Digital Public Library of America art store, and it's been back and forth. Also, when you could, to the original source. And it's really hard to tell sometimes whether the data is referring to like. So I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of the so like Urban's position there is like, well, if people are reading data, then that's not a problem. When that's a problem is when it's computers. So, once again, it sort of comes down, I think, oh, what is that data actually used for? In information science, data science now, again, there is a traditional perspective that data is always good, and that aggregation is always and sustainable data to be transported across context is going to have a benefit in the future. But if that's the case, then what can we?
I have a follow-up question. Is taking more care even possible?
Well, there's that, right? So, now without resources.
Right, okay.
And that's another thing that I emphasize in the book, but I feel like only over time, I keep thinking about more and more. The labor associated with creating data, whether it's human labor or machine labor, is very undervalued. Partly because we tend to think of these tasks as menial ones, when anyone actually cares to look at some actual data, that you immediately notice that that's not the case, because there's all this but if we want to be able to do the talking about and a little more care that requires.
And then it begs the question, can we entrust the machines to pick out these nuances carefully enough, considering the scope and physical? Do you want to?
I think that open it up to you. One more you'd like to.
I have one more question. Okay. And this, I read your chapter on taxonomy, and I thought the general thought was that you said they forced a measure of honesty. And I was thinking about that in my next class when we were discussing Afrocentrism, and just kind of the idea of how marginalized communities connect to their origins by restructuring their histories, their collective histories. And my question for you is, how can taxonomy be a tool for and against social justice revolution?
Well, so one of the things that I talk about in the chapter on taxonomy is that there are two different understandings of hierarchy. And one understanding of hierarchy involves power. But the taxonomic understanding of hierarchy, the taxonomic understanding of hierarchy involves kind and inheritance. It isn't necessarily about power at all. in power hierarchy, they work to hide what's going on. But economic hierarchy work to make the structure apparent. They make the rationale of the structure apparent. Because the point of a good hierarchy is to have its principles of decision open. And so not everything fits in a taxonomic structure. So like those relationships can in their own way, like what is put into them. At the same time, the process by which things are structured, like it gets revealed through the structure itself. So from that perspective, I feel like at least having a sense of what that kind of structure can be for us, can serve the cause of social justice, because part of that is at least having some transparency about what we're doing. Like, I also feel like it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to have our human values represented in the way that we structure things. But want to be careful when we're doing that. Try to be as possible in how we're letting them structure. Obvious. So anything that we can do to try and make those values transparent in the stuff that we're creating, that will only help our cause.
That reminds me of adding on to that. I feel like taxonomy, you also say it endeavors to explain things even as it never completes that explanation. I think that really gives us an opening to explore society and our values more dynamically. And I think it's so important because taxonomy and these classifications, they inform how we interact with information digitally, which then translates into our perceptions and our worldviews, which then carries over how we interact with people and our actions moving forward in the real non-virtual world. So I think that's a really important piece. That was my last question.
I'd love to open this up to full conversation. I'm sure we have questions from the room as well. So, Lee, I see you ready to start us off.
That was great. Thanks so much. That was a lot of fun. And so I have two sort of related questions. The first, you said that information science is boring. Do you see it as part of your job of making it less boring? Because like, you know, let me just elaborate on that. Yeah, it's boring until you like start to animate all the things behind like this classification system, right? Like we look at schema.org and I'm like, I don't know what that means. But then when you start to explain, here's the politics, the assumptions, the values, and here's why these differences matter, it stops actually being boring. It becomes like really fascinating. So like is showing that part of, and then related to that, what's domain expertise look like for a classicist, a classificationist in terms of like knowing about dogs and cheese and all these things, and your ability to animate these categories by knowing something about the things that they're referring to?
Yes, such a question. Ryan and I have a debate about this. Ongoing debate about this all the time. I tend to be on the side of there is a specific expertise of structure, a classificatory expertise. And part of that, like I'm going to admit, like comes from my own background, starting in my professional background as a technical editor at Apple Computer. That's where I discovered I was really good at structuring, right? Like structure by task just came really natural. And so like, I feel like there is a skill and expertise in being able to like understand the structure of anything. of course, like, you also need to understand that some of the particularities of any like domain that you're working in. What's the extent to which that's something that you can just like pick up, right? Like as an editor, I never necessarily had particular expertise that I was editing. I was damn good at it. On the other hand, and there are other people who also have that view in information science. Marcia Bay, legendary. On the other hand, it's also an equal perspective that the kinds of things that can be taught are the explanatory expertise, right? And what really is maybe a better way to go is to have domain expert about information structure and then be able to work from within in any particular. I think you can go both ways. I guess I haven't. To me, I feel like the domain knowledge is easier to, but I will admit that's just fine. It's a question. I also will say it's a question I get a lot. Particularly from people like in the business school. Whenever I've said to people in the business school, like, oh, I study organization of information or classroom structure problem, like, of what? Like, what's your vertical? And I'm like,
I have an additional question. Okay, this is not one that I prepared. I also teach a seminar course here for computer and information science students on law. And that can be quite a dry topic. And so I try and do what is information synthesis and making it relatable. But what is the biggest tip that you have that whole process, which can be quite taxing?
I read the newspaper. And I feel like that is like a big way because then I'm always finding. I also try to have people. But the doing things can also be, like fun things.
Yeah. For my final project, a lot of people are writing children's books on facial recognition software. So I get what you're saying about doing things really connected, like super stuff.
Couple more. Let's go just, I guess, right to left from my perspective, but left to right for the room.
I think people write other
I'm thinking about it. I was really, it was really hard writing this one, but it was also one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book. We're not a book. I was arranged by like article format. And so there was a lot of nice freedom in being able to I've been contemplating for a long time doing something more and having that. I think it would have to be more book-like because the nuts and bolts, again, like it's hard to make it not be boring. It's hard to I don't know.
Thank you for your copy in your book. But I'd love to push back a little bit, or I mean, a little bit more. How taxonomy not have power, even if it's transparent. So like thinking about media, for example, right? Because so like, I don't get how any kind of categorization doesn't.
I didn't say that taxonomic structure didn't.
Oh,
That's
it's
very
like,
two different kinds of hierarchy.
sure. So what's that other one? That's the one I'm not.
So the other one, I don't. Talk about. They mean, you know, like, a ruler. And that's not the kinds of relationships that are in taxonomy. That's just a power relationship, right? Like the ruler controls, and stars aren't a kind of.
Okay, I just completely misunderstood what you were saying. Thank you.
In this book, it's part of your work, kind of you know, yourself as designer, maybe like interior designer, they arrange things big at a professional phase, graphic designer. What is to like an information designer? Imagine a person to arrange information, maybe pleasing or visual way.
That's a good question. I think that it's a complicated question because what is feeling, say, from a classificatory perspective might be totally so there is a challenge there. But then I feel like part of and the reason that might be the case is because something that is structurally neat, kind of alluding to what I was talking about with Katie, doesn't necessarily align with how we actually like use concepts. Be structurally neat would say like have each concept only refer to our lives of. So to have something beautiful in that way isn't necessarily useful. On the other hand, I feel like there's a different kind of beauty that potentially comes from the messiness itself. So surface that. Yeah. I feel like, but just like as I focus more on like the labor and the process, it's harder to separate design and implementation. Probably.
Great talk, Melanie. Follow up a little bit on the design question, because when you think about more faceted classification that sort of was whatever the use case, it's possible to actually judge better designs, layouts, beauty is one thing, functionality, and we assess that as we teach design. Or is it that is heavy organic?
What is what you mean by assessment? If by assessment you mean some kind of like quantitative evaluation, I don't think so. On the other hand, I feel like there can be some kind of just like the way, I mean, how we assess a chair, right? There are lots of different ways to assess a chair. Some of which might involve some kind of like how much give is it? But like that's not really gonna say a lot for the experience fit for most people, right? So like the way you're gonna get more information about the chair is to use some kind based on some articulated set of criteria. That's where the the aspect of the
These do win, lose in market.
often not because they're good, right? Like
You know,
but like take it to one that's the best. Like
because one doesn't come, the reason it wins in the marketplace is because it has some sort of functional advantage.
or because the company that produces it have the market. There are lots of reasons why something is.
This is why I think information science is not boring.
Amen.
I'd love to thank everyone for joining us today. I see some new faces in the room, so I'd love to also say, if you'd like to stay in any kind of touch with us, we love to hold events like this, bringing other speakers. Tomorrow there is a symposium on information science for social good or information for social good. It will be live streamed, so we'll be sharing that on our Twitter. Join us tomorrow. That will be held in the student union.
Yeah, the whole event is open, and then we also have a featured talk, Dr. Tanya Sutherland from UCLA is going to give our keynote, and she's amazing in writing too. With the excited, so please come.
Yes, the SILS symposium is tomorrow. The keynote is co-sponsored by CTAB. We're really excited to be a small part of this bigger event. But if you'd like to keep hearing from us and hear about future speakers we bring, you can find us on the web at ctab.unc.edu.
Our new website.
Yay, yes. You can find us on Twitter for as long as Twitter continues at UNC_CTAB. And you can find us here within UNC at CTAB@UNC.edu. Get in touch. We'd love to having you be part of our team. So thanks everyone for joining us today.
He started there, like, kind of. I know, yeah, it built really well.
Yeah. Like a mail, it's like.